The next topic is viral diseases of the skin, and what you will see is that some of these could be put in lecture 14, which includes diseases of the genitourinary tracts. But whenever possible, I like to take pressure off of you all at the end of a unit, and so I want the last lecture to be the shortest one. And so that's why I'm covering those fully here where they come up. And the first of those is the human papillomavirus. There are a lot of different strains of human papillomavirus, so we could almost say human papillomaviruses. And they cause sexually transmitted infections and non-sexually transmitted skin infections. So here we are. They're caused by viruses, naked viruses. So, many viruses have envelopes, but these do not. And this one has a double-stranded DNA genome, and the virions are very small. So those are the things people would typically say about them. And icosahedral refers to the shape of the virion. So very small, regularly shaped, double-stranded DNA. Diseases caused by human papillomavirus or HPV include the common warts you'd see on people's fingers or toes or the soles of the feet, and genital warts, which are sexually transmitted. And then several cancers are caused by human papillomaviruses. Their DNA can interfere with human DNA. So one distinction that clinicians make is between the cutaneous HPV infections and mucosal HPV infections. And so the strains that specialize in cutaneous infections will infect epidermal cells. And they can really infect epidermal cells anywhere in the body. It's just that the way that they get into the body is through small cuts and scratches, and those typically happen to the hands and feet. So the hands and feet are where we typically see common warts. So those are cutaneous. The mucosal ones specialize in infecting mucosal epithelia, like what you would find in the reproductive tract or in the pharynx or oral cavity, or the anus and the anal and rectal mucosa. And so those strains are the more dangerous ones. We call some of those high-risk strains that can cause cancers in these organs. Okay, so HPV is very common, as I'll show you in the next couple slides. And it is important to remember that there are multiple different strains, some of which can cause common warts, but not other diseases, some of which can only infect mucosal surfaces, so they would not put you at risk of getting common warts. And we will come to that in a minute. But just first, how common is HPV? Well, it is the most common STI in terms of prevalence, so the total number of people infected. It's more common than herpes simplex 2, and it's more common than trichomonas. And this is not even to scale. So this is 24 million, 3 million. So these are kind of to scale. And then this one is a jump from 3 million to 24 million. And then this is a jump from 24 to 79 million. So this is like 3 times more common than the next most common sexually transmitted infection in the US. These numbers are a little bit old. These are from 2008. I've seen some newer numbers, but the trends haven't changed. The point is that HPV is by far the most common STI in terms of how many total cases. And then if we look at how many new infections there are every year, again, it is by far the most common. And later in the term, well, we'll come back to this. We will. Okay, so the first disease we look at that's caused by the HPV is common warts, and these are just benign tumors of epidermal tissue. So they're infecting the epidermis but not really crossing it. And in this case, they're just causing massive overgrowth of epidermal cells. Let's see what else. They are spread through contact. If you get a cut in your skin, just disruption of the epidermis, that is all it takes to let this virus in and let it get started. But if you don't have any cuts, you won't get it. So just touching someone's wart won't give you a wart. And the idea is that hands and feet are what typically gets scratched most often, so they're most likely to be susceptible to warts. But you know, any scratch anywhere in your body can allow these viruses in. Genital warts can be caused by cutaneous strains or mucosal strains, and most of them are the low-risk strains. So we think of 6 and 11 as very common. These are what cause the majority of genital warts. And so here's some more data about how common it is, but the point is that if we prevent these two strains from infecting people, we prevent 90% of cases of genital warts. Let's see. Treatment-wise, there isn't really an antiviral that I'm aware of against HPV. So treating the warts themselves, there are lots of ways to remove warts, and that's what the treatments would typically be. But we can prevent HPV either using barriers during sexual activity or using the HPV vaccine. I should back up because I've been saying STI a lot, and there are a lot of different terms for sexually transmitted diseases. Venereal disease is one we used to hear a lot. Sexually transmitted infection is the most useful term because in a situation like HPV where we could get latency, well, there's no disease during latency. This is even more useful for things like, like the herpes viruses that really do go into lifelong latency for most people, and a person infected by a herpes virus may never ever experience disease from it. That's a possibility. And so sexually transmitted infection, it truly is because it is infecting the body. Sexually transmitted disease, it isn't unless it's causing an actual disease. So I do make this distinction, and it is important to make this distinction. Because something we notice again and again is anything that's transmitted asymptomatically has a high chance of becoming widespread. That's the big difference between SARS and SARS-CoV-2, for example. The SARS virus that caused SARS does not spread asymptomatically. SARS-CoV-2 spreads asymptomatically. That's the real big difference between those two. That's why one of them caused some panic and the other one caused a global pandemic of massive proportions. And it's the same thing with STIs. The ones that can spread asymptomatically, that don't immediately cause disease, these are the ones that are extremely widespread. So again, HPV can cause cancers, and the majority are caused by strains 16 and 18 and strain 31 and 45. Between the four of these, that accounts for 75% of cervical cancers. HPV also causes penile cancers and oropharyngeal cancers. And so preventing these infections, if possible, prevents these cancers. And early screening can allow us to treat these cancers and prevent them from becoming much more serious. So we can detect HPV indirectly using the Pap test to look for deformations in cells or abnormal growth that could be precancerous. We can also test directly for the virus. That is kind of routine. But prevention is really what we need to do. And prevention, the best prevention comes from the vaccines, and there are 3 that I'm aware of. The first one, Gardasil, protected against 4 different strains. So the 2 most common cancer-causing strains and the 2 most common warts-causing strain. This was the first vaccine that could prevent cancers. So that's kind of amazing. The newer version, Gardasil 9, includes 5 other strains. And so instead of preventing, let's see, Gardasil could prevent 2/3 of cancers. Gardasil 9 can prevent 80% of cervical cancers. And I don't know how to say this one, but it protects against the 2 most common cervical cancer strains. A completely different disease is smallpox. Smallpox doesn't exist in the wild to our knowledge, and we'll come back to that. So it's from the Pox viridae, and it is a double-stranded DNA virus with an envelope, and it's large. So if you compare this to the HPV size we saw, that was something like 50 nanometers. This is like 300 nanometers. So it's much bigger, and it has much more complex structure and much more complex behaviors. It's a DNA virus, but it replicates in the cytoplasm. So what does that mean? What enzymes does it have to carry? Well, to copy its DNA genome, it has to encode its own DNA, replicase enzyme. And I don't remember whether it puts its DNA in the nucleus after that or not, but if it doesn't, it needs to make its own RNA polymerase. It needs to do its own transcription. Because remember, that normally happens in the nucleus. So this is the kind of things you could think about with any one of these viruses. Any detail you learn about any virus tells you a little bit about it and brings up more questions about it. Smallpox doesn't affect any other animals, and that's one reason why it was why it was possible to eradicate it in the wild. But it was a horrifying and common infection right up through the 50s and 60s. It was the first disease against which we could vaccinate people. Vaccinia was cowpox, and we could take, it turned out, the cowpox wouldn't infect people, but if you injected cowpox into people, they would get protection against smallpox. And so vaccinia was our first vaccine. Anyway, this is a thing I keep coming back to, is like, why could we eradicate smallpox? Well, it had a slow mutation rate. So one vaccine would be effective all over the world for years. And that made it easier to do things like vaccinate people in developing countries. Smallpox doesn't have any reservoirs outside of humans, so unlike something like influenza, it doesn't come back year after year, and birds and bats and pigs and dogs don't bring it back to people. There are different viruses that come back to people from those animals, but not smallpox. And then another big one is smallpox always causes signs. You can look at someone and know they're very sick if they have smallpox. Typically, you can look at them and know they have smallpox during a large part of their disease. But someone who is infected and able to spread this virus is so sick that they're not walking around doing anything. So it's easy to avoid getting smallpox, because if you stay away from people who are covered with pox, or people who are lying down and very sick, you're not going to get it. So as we look later at influenza in detail, or you can actually answer some of this now, and as we look through the herpes viruses, think about why we cannot eradicate them, and you'll see some of these things would be different. Okay, so smallpox was spread through droplets. And smallpox causes lesions, or pox. And those lesions would be infectious. And so some of the first ones that would develop would be in the pharynx. And so a person could cough or, they could cough and they would spread droplets full of smallpox virions. There wasn't a treatment for it, and it's so dangerous. It's such a horrible thing. And it took the world so many resources, so much money, so much work went into eradicating it that we now consider it one of the most serious diseases. We want to protect that eradicated status. So if you want to study smallpox, you do that in a biosafety level 4 laboratory. And that means everyone working with it has to wear a space suit, basically. And it has the maximum security around it. So to go into that lab, you pass lots of people, lots of soldiers, basically. Because the idea is anyone who wants to do terrible things, any terrorist organization or rogue state would love to get a hold of smallpox because they could threaten the developed world with releasing smallpox into the wild. And so we have actual military protection for the labs that store smallpox. And it's only, to our knowledge, it only exists in one lab in the US and one lab in Russia. Why do we care so much about smallpox? Well, 30% of cases were fatal. Many cases caused serious complications, like blindness, during smallpox outbreaks. It was the most common cause of blindness. Once smallpox was eradicated, 30% of causes of blindness disappeared overnight, and blindness became less common. Throughout history, look at that number, 500 million. That's 500 million people were killed by smallpox. Smallpox vaccine is available, and every country that can stockpiles the vaccine just in case anybody does decide to release it into the wild, because we don't ever want to see this again. So if we do see it again, chances are it's because someone has released it deliberately. So the reason I bring this up and belabor this so much is that if smallpox ever is released, we want to know it as soon as possible and react to it as soon as possible. If you see someone come into a clinic who has smallpox, that is an emergency. So it's important that you know what it is and even how to recognize it. Smallpox is so serious, just read this. We can't imagine a disease like this. There is no disease like this currently in the world that is as common and as dangerous as smallpox. So eradicating smallpox is one of the biggest wins in human history. Okay, so what happens during smallpox? Well, initially a person gets a high fever and they feel very sick. And then a little bit later they get a rash that appears, and this rash is what's distinct about smallpox. The rash will become bumps and they fill with fluid, and then they get an indentation in the center and they become pustules, so they become hard, and then eventually they scab over and leave behind unpigmented skin, and in some cases scars. So some people who have smallpox were permanently scarred. And so here we're going to see one patient, we're going to see they took pictures of this person over time to show the rash. So this would be the initial rash. This would be the early stages. This would be where the pockmarks are forming, and these would be full of fluid. And here you see a few with that distinctive center indentation, and then they begin to scab over. And then eventually when they heal, they leave behind unpigmented skin. So just imagine seeing somebody like this. They're extremely sick. They feel terrible. It's affecting their whole body, and they have this on their skin. This is a famous picture of one of the last people who had smallpox. Just imagine every part of your skin having those hard lesions, and it's a 2-week long disease course. So a person who gets smallpox would have to be quarantined for 2 weeks, and during that entire time, someone would have to take care of them because they would have difficulty doing things like getting out of bed. So smallpox wasn't just fatal, it was also extremely disruptive, and any town that could avoid it would avoid it. Smallpox is complicated. There were different types, and this is for your curiosity. You can skip this if you want to. But basically, this picture is of the ordinary smallpox, and this is ordinary smallpox. And the prognosis for these people is good. Typically, ordinary smallpox would resolve. The person might be scarred, they might be blind, but they wouldn't die. But there were these weirder cases. In about 30% of cases would be either the flat type, where the lesions look weird, they don't rise, or the hemorrhagic types, where the lesions get blood in them. And these were the ones that were always fatal. So if a person developed this kind of smallpox, it would move faster and it would kill them. Okay, so that's enough about smallpox. Just never forget smallpox if you are going to be a clinician.